members of public, members, invited guests to today's meeting of the Police and Crime Committee. Our main item of business today is a Q&A session on policing and mental health. We've got a few items of formal business first. As ever, members of the public, please do follow us on Twitter at London Assembly. Take part in the discussion, hashtag Assembly Police. As ever, please turn to silent or turn off your mobile phones. Item 1, apologies for absence.
There are no apologies, Chairman.
Excellent, no apologies for absence this morning. Declaration of interest. You can ask the committee to note the recommendations and ask Assembly members to declare any other disclosable interests that are not so detailed. Thank you very much. Item 3, can ask the committee to note completed ongoing actions on the previous meetings of the committee. Item 4, can ask the committee to note the recent action taken by me as chairman under delegated authority to agree arrangements for the committee's recent round table. Great, we get to the main part of this morning. We've been given notice that Chief Inspector Brown is running a tad late. He will be here without the shadow of a doubt. I'm looking forward to hearing from him. So again, this morning's session is around mental health and policing. The committee has done a significant amount of work with this in the past. However, it is clear to us that the increase in interactions between Met Police and Londoners with mental health issues is increasing, and we wanted to reflect on that and reflect on early reports and progress made, and we have some excellent guests this morning, if I may say. What I'd like you to do, guests, is if you could just briefly introduce yourself. You have plenty of time later to talk about the organisation. Perhaps you just briefly introduce yourselves.
My name is Andy Trotter. I'm the chair of the Oxleas NHS Foundation Trust in South East London, who provides mental health and community nursing. And I was a police officer for 45 years.
Of course, Andy, welcome.
Hi, I'm Vicki Nash. I'm Head of Policy and Campaigns at Mind.
Right, thank you.
Vicki Adebowale. I'm the Chief Executive of Turning Point and former chair of the independent review of police and crime, police and mental health, in London.
Welcome, Vicki.
Good morning, my name is Shuttleworth. I am the newly elected Diversity and Equality Lead Secretary for the Metropolitan Police Federation.
Thank you very much. Welcome. Okay, so this is in the context of, obviously, Lord Victor's report in 2013, and you came back in front of this committee in 2014, and also in the context that only last month HMIC FRS published a report again on this subject. And in a very crowded field of reports, there was the final report of the Independent Government Review. So there's been a lot of work going on, which I think identifies the fact that this is an important issue. So I will start the questioning, if I may, and this is mainly around scene setting, high level, about demand. So this is to all of you, and this again, remember the context of this committee is scrutinising the Met, is scrutinising the Mayor and MOPEC on behalf of Londoners. So the Mayor's Police and Crime Plan talks of transforming the Metropolitan Police Service, making it fit for the 21st century. In that context, what does a service that is fit for purpose look like in response to mental health needs in London? Any colleagues?
The report that I completed in 2013 rather, set out pretty much the description of what a mentally aware mental health police force should look like. There were 27 recommendations, but to highlight a number of them, or highlight the key aspects. One, a frontline police force that's fully trained and fully aware of its responsibilities, updated on a regular basis. A leadership that's aware of the culture within the police force, because it's not just what's happening out there, it's also about the mental health of police men and women. Strong partnerships between the police and the NHS. My report, while focused on the police, referred to partnerships with the NHS. The police can't do it alone, so there needs to be strong partnerships with the NHS. Examples are things like the triage services, and the recognition that mental health, at the time I did the report, there was more response to mental health incidents by the police than there were to robbery and sexual offences put together. That situation has increased, and as the Her Majesty's Inspectorate has pointed out.
So these were responses to incidents that were primarily mental health incidents,
Yeah.
as opposed to other offences that it was discovered later had mental health.
Well, we didn't make that distinction.
There's a distinction there, isn't
A
there?
part of the problem with making the, being unable to make the distinction en route to the incident, as we found in when we did the report, was that the police IT and communication systems weren't up to informing police officers on the way to an incident as to whether it was a mental health incident or not, or indeed any information about the actual individual that they were going to meet. So they were often faced with a fight or flight position, really, without the information.
Okay.
I have to say that, having received an update from the Met Police, it's clear that a lot of activity has taken place at the Met Police. We're not in the same position that we were in 2012.
I'm going to ask you in a minute a little bit about updating and progress, so you can give us some more detail
But we're
around
not
that.
there
So thank you, sir. On this high level point, would other colleagues like to see what they would like to see generally as an approach and a Met in the 21st century?
We have a very strong partnership with the Met, and actually I've been very impressed with both the strategic and local level, the partnership that we've got at the moment. We meet regularly with our partners in our boroughs to talk through particular issues, and operational level further down, there are regular meetings to discuss incidents, to debrief matters. And clearly things from time to time don't go well, but I find it's a very good, strong partnership with a leadership that's very interested in this issue. Quite clearly, the Met is under great strain as far as resources are concerned, and quite clearly they have anxieties about, as has been highlighted in the HMI report that you referred to, about the amount of time they spend on mental health matters. But I find a real willingness. We're not into blaming each other. There's a real willingness to work together, which I'm very impressed with at the moment.
Okay. And that's an improvement, probably what you've heard and experienced of a while back.
Absolutely, and I think, and from my own personal experience in the past, I think there's been a transformation actually in the Metropolitan Police approach to this.
That's very
Can I
good.
make one more point, Chair, if I can, which is one of the indicators that the Met Police have moved on, is that disproportionality, the disproportionate experience of black and minority ethnic individuals in relation to mental health and policing would be reduced, actually would disappear altogether.
Right, okay. We're going to pick up on that subject, I think, a little bit. Thank you very much for that. Vicky?
Yeah, I mean, I'd really echo what Andy and Victor have said in terms of what what a true future vision looks like. I think you want to make sure that you've got a very well-trained force that's competent but also compassionate, particularly when it's needing to deal with people that are experiencing a mental health crisis and an emergency situation. You absolutely need a multi-agency approach, so it's about how the services work together, both paramedics and ambulances, together with the police, together with the health service. And it's actually about putting patients' experiences at the heart of that, and their experiences should be driving the priorities and the improvements that you see in that. And I think that Met have made good progress on that. There's still a long way to go. Lots done, lots to do.
So we're hearing certainly from Andy and Vicky that there has been progress made, and we'll get on to detail about what more needs to be done. From a federation point of view, Anne?
Do forgive me here because I'm new to this, and I've had to do a little bit of running around and do a bit of homework.
Oh, that's fine.
Because I can only speak from a federation perspective. I can't obviously sit here and speak from Met management perspective. It's not for me to comment on.
No, we want to hear from the Fed aspect.
But from my perspective, as having just taken this role and beforehand being an on-borough rep, looking after officers who were in all sorts of dire straits because of dealing with mental health issues, whether inside buildings or outside. I think a lot of progress has been made from what I just read this week. I'm quite amazed to see how much work has been done. And anything that reduces stress and risk and complaint for police officers has got to be a good thing. Anything we do that improves what we're doing has got to be good. because having represented officers whose cases of complaint have gone on for a very long time, and the stress that that causes, very often we forget that, you know, police officers perhaps just go out to do a day's work, not going to look for any trouble at all, just to do their best. That's what they join the job for. They go out to do their job, and lo and behold, something goes wrong, and they get a complaint or they get served a notice of misconduct or worse. And from there on, having represented and supported officers in the past, from there on, you often find that they then become victims of mental health themselves.
Indeed, yeah.
So yes, I'm just in a week, having read this, very quick time, I have to say, I'm highly impressed with where we are with this. More work to be done, obviously, but that's from the Federation perspective. I hope that's helpful.
I mean, you're right. Well, the work that we're doing is looking across the whole spectrum for Londoners who with mental health issues and the problems that they face, to the range where officers who are going out in the morning to do their duty and are confronted often with Londoners with very complex mental health issues and they need for training around that. Len, did you signal?
Yeah, you may not be able to help me with this question, but just to give me some pointers at going in the right direction. A lot's happened and the direction of travel is in the right direction. I get that with the various reports from Victor's report, 2030 national reports. It's one of the tests that when I come to ask the right people, we seem to be very good when something goes wrong and learning the lessons around that. In the day-to-day bits of managerial interactions and partnerships, is there any mechanism where we pick up on some of the minor things that go wrong that then can be addressed in terms of some of this work? And I think that's the strength of where partnership working. And I ask this question of you because no doubt when we follow up and ask questions of MOPAC and the Mayor's office or the police around those interactions from their point of view, do you get a sense that some of those not major crisis incidents that where we have to form, you know, inquiries about because it's gone terribly wrong, but some of those day-to-day encounters where people learn from it, don't learn from it, on the job, could we have done better? I'm quite interested in some of those little, they're not minor because they're big, but they've not become a catastrophe in that sense of those issues. And I would just like to get a feel about that from...
You'll have some detailed questions later, but perhaps you can respond.
We do have meetings at an inspector level with our middle management on a regular basis because so I meet with the borough commanders and sometimes at the yard to talk with those there. But that goes on regular meetings and meetings to look at where things didn't go right because they don't, you know, from both sides quite frequently. But what I do like is a much more intelligent dialogue between us on that. You know, for example, there might be real frustration for the frontline officer when we've taken a long time to find a bed. Whose responsibility, who did it, who got one, that sort of thing happens quite a lot. There's a form that they use to hand over a voluntary patient to the emergency department, which the Met designed, which is really good. Doesn't always get used, and it's going back over that and just helping with the front line. But it is an intelligent approach and it's a thoughtful one because in the middle of the night things can get a bit heated sometimes and our on-duty directors will be called up to try and sort something out. But I do think we have the mechanisms in place because those are the things that really gnaw at people, you know, when we don't get it right. And I think at the moment the relationship is fine and it works well.
I'd just add to that I think the processes that those, if you get the day-to-day processes right, then it should dramatically reduce when you do have those incidents and those crises. And the work of the local crisis care concordat groups that were set up as part of the broader kind of crisis care concordat work were absolutely looking at how you get the small bits right and the details and the forms right? Are we duplicating effort? What's the handover? How can you smooth out all of those transitions? Now, I think since the foot has been taken off the pedal around the crisis care concordat at national level, that's inevitably had an impact at local level as to how successful those local groups are still meeting, and it would be variable. But that was completely designed to take that multi-agency approach and to deal with the small things as well as the big things.
So specifically, So there's two things. One is the Met capable of organisational learning from small incidents? And one of the recommendations in the report was recommendation 6, the implementation of an organisational learning strategy. Because you can have as many small conversations you like, but if the organisation isn't learning, then you're back to square one. And there has been progress on that in the establishment of an organisational learning board. The question that might be asked by you of the Met is what is the organisation? Give me 6 points that the organisation has learnt. More specifically, the transportation and the partnership with the ambulance service. What we found was that the system, CAD system, I'm going from memory here, actually, if a policeman was present or policewoman was present, an incident actually reduced and that is a problem. And I know that work's been done to ensure that people who are mentally ill, haven't committed a crime, they're mentally ill, have appropriate transport at the time, and that the ambulance response is equal to any other response, because from a police person's point of view, actually they need the support of the other emergency services as opposed to being abandoned by those services because of resource issues. So that there's a specific conversation that has been had, which I'm pleased to see has been had, about transportation and ensuring that the police get the support they need from the ambulance service, and the signs of life in terms of police, the Met's organisational learning.
Okay, thank you for that. The question really now from me to you, Lord Victor, particularly regarding your report. When you came to the committee in 2014, I think you said that 12 out of the 28 recommendations were in place. This was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And the others were ongoing. Is the Met in a significantly better place now than it was? And what more is left to do, particularly with reference to your recommendations?
Well, it's a nice short question. I've received updates from the Metropolitan Police. What I can say is that they have a response to each of my recommendations, which wasn't the case when I was last before you.
Right.
I can safely say that most of the recommendations are in progress, if not completed. Mm-hmm. There are some notable completions that are taking place actually in partnership, it would appear, with the Mayor's efforts in his report on policing, in particular, I think pages 101 and 75, where things like trialling mental health investigation teams to work with partners to problem solve, that's in place. I'm hoping it's being rolled out. The provision of measures to divert victims are also in place and are being rolled out. We now have, I think, 100% occupation of diversion schemes, which was a particular recommendation of my colleague Keith Bradley, Lord Bradley. So that's happening. That's actually happened. They're starting to think about review the health service for people in custody in partnership with NHS England, which was one of my recommendations. They haven't done it yet, but it's taken a long time, but they're getting to a point where the NHS is involved in health, which is a key intervention to prevent deaths and injury, which is where we were. To be fair, the Met have done a lot, but they haven't completed everything. Okay. That's my summary would be that they've done a lot of work on some of the key issues that will prevent death and serious injury, but there's still a lot more to do, and of course this is set against a background of increasing demand.
Indeed. I assume you're working with the Met and scrutinising them to ensure that they are attempting to deliver your recommendations. How's that process just interested, how does that process?
I'm not the full-time chair of the commission.
I'm sure you're not, of course.
I have attempted to engage with the Met on recommendations because, I felt I went out with the police. I spoke to 55 families and relatives of people who died and been injured in terrible circumstances. So I feel a personal attachment to this work.
That's cool.
It's been challenging at times to get the information. I have to say that, but I understand the Met are tremendous pressure, so I'm sympathetic to that view. Having gone out with the police on more than one occasion, it is a very, very tough job. They did provide my colleagues with an update on the report. I suspect that, I mean, one of the recommendations was in the report that I did was that the Met was more publicly accountable for its work on this, and that the Commissioner did an annual report to the public on its work in relation to mental health, because the public have to have confidence in the police response to mental health incidents. Over 1 million Londoners have mental health challenges. I'm not sure that's happened, but as I say, progress has been made, and they've been more than willing to talk to me about that when I've requested.
We'll be pursuing later the Mayor's and MOPAC's context. I mean, before I bring Peter in, my last question to you, you talked about progress being made, and you sound quite optimistic the way that it's moving with the resources limitations. Is there any particular one or two recommendations that are disappointing you, particularly that the progress hasn't been made? Or are they all kind of moving on in the right direction?
Well, I'm an impatient man generally when it comes to these things. I think that death and serious injury as a result of poor leadership or poor resourcing of this area is unacceptable. So I'm generally impatient. I think that I'll always say that the Met and could move faster, because the slower they work, the more risk that individuals out there are taking. So I would generally say we need to move faster.
Yes.
The rollout of things like Thrive are indications of good practice. The way the BCUs are working are good. I would like a clearer public acknowledgement of the police's responsibilities in relation to mental health. They do have a responsibility under Section 2, I think, of the Human Rights Act to do that, and to do so publicly. I think that they are making progress. I cannot sit in all honesty and say, well, I'm really pleased that everything's fine, because it isn't.
No, I mean, you need to keep that pressure of being an impatient person for change. Thank you very much. Peter, do you want to come in?
Yes, I think some of it's actually been covered, but Victor, can I stop? I mean, what are the, first of all, the material factors that might get in the way of the Met addressing mental health effectively? What are the material issues?
The key material issue is resource.
Yeah.
I mean, the Met have been, I don't think it's a secret, the Met have been very clear about the lack of resource. I mean, not just there are two. There's the lack of resource, which has only got worse since I did the report. I don't think that's a secret in terms of police numbers, and that will put pressures on the front line. That's kind of obvious. But there's a second issue, which is the pressures that the NHS and organisations that work with the NHS have been under since my report has been written. So, for instance, I think it's an indication of the police's determinations that we have got the shifts in the custody suites. We've now got nurses in 100% of them. I mean, that's an achievement given the pressures on the NHS. I think the conversations that they're having with the NHS around what happens in custody suites and commissioning health is also an indication of what they're doing under really stressful resource conditions. My concern is that as Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary pointed out, the fact of the matter is that other services that are under tremendous pressure aren't responding to the increased demand, and in those circumstances the police are being used as a last resort, which is where I came in.
So they're not responding purely out of lack of money?
Well, the indication would be that they're being forced to respond because other services don't have the resources to either deal with this issue in a preventative way or indeed respond to it appropriately in a crisis.
They plug the gap.
Sorry, did you want to ask something?
I was just going to say they plug the gap.
Yeah, they should be plugging the gap.
Yeah, where the other services are failing to meet demand.
The report that we're talking about also talks a lot about the need for a greater understanding, not on a material level, as it were, in another way. And, I wonder how that could be achieved. I mean, perhaps if I could ask Andy, you were a policeman for 40 years. Oxleas Trust, is that anything to do with Oxleas House in Queen Elizabeth Hospital?
Oh, yes, that is part of one of our
My
buildings.
father was there with Alzheimer's.
Oh, really?
They treated him very kindly. He
That's
died
nice.
there, actually.
That is good to hear. That is good to hear. Yes, so we...
Anyway, that's by the by.
Yes.
But in your experience, therefore, 40 years, whatever, what has to change, if you like, in general? Is it an attitudinal thing? What is it?
I think there's been absolute transformation from, it would be, wouldn't it, from when I started, which was a very, very long time ago. But I think not only at senior level, but at individual police officer level, I think the sensitivity and understanding of these issues is absolutely transformed over the years. And it has been often through crises, through dreadful incidents, that there's been a lot of learning that has made those great changes. But I think also through the training, and I think, to be frank, the calibre of those people coming into the organisation are much more aware of societal needs across the board. And I think that's made a big, big difference. But I can only add that we have a police officer working with us full time. We have liaison in custody suites and in courts as well. So everyone's trying to work together. But echoing the point that's been made, there are huge stresses on the numbers of beds which are available, on the pressures on the Section 136 suites where the police officers take people who've been detained under the Mental Health Act. But across, I can speak for South London, we're working with other partners across South London to look at the adult mental health crisis pathway, because we have mental health patients waiting in A&E for a long, long time, with or without police officers, sometimes hours and hours and hours before we can have them properly assessed and then find a place for them, which is, I think, there's no other class of person that gets treated in this way. And so that is the area we're really working on. And for example, we've got a patient assessment suite that sits next to Oxleas House, where we can take people from A&E, take them to a safe place and look after them while we look at them. And sometimes they get over that crisis, just might be drink or drugs induced, and we can care for them there far better than you can in A&E, because the pressures on there, particularly with the winter crisis coming up, are getting greater and greater. But this is an area of real focus for us all, because, as I say, I don't think any other class of patient will be treated this way.
Might I say just a couple of things. In response to your question, in terms of the police attitude, there are three things that matter and that are all kinds of happening. The first is we made a recommendation around training of police officers.
Around?
Training of police officers. That's now being rolled out in terms of how they respond to mental health incidents, but also I'm pleased to note that there's improved training about how to remain mentally well as a police officer, which has been rolled out. Secondly, I know that Mind are doing some work with the police as an employer. I'm slightly disappointed that they're not taking advantage of some of the digital police, some of the digital mental health apps out there that can be used by police officers privately without having to refer, because one of the issues was police officers who were under pressure feeling embarrassed about saying so, and I think the availability of some of the digital interventions that can be used securely by it could be a rapid response to that. And finally, I think we might give the Met might give itself some credit for the fact that the leadership of the Met under the old commissioner, who actually started this in the first place, the current commissioner, seems to be in place. So the leadership of the Met, and ultimately this is about leadership, seems to be as concerned as we are about the mental health issues. So those are signs that there's been a shift in the culture and in the practice.
Can I just ask one thing, Andy, that came out of what you were saying there? Just this moment, it's not in the question. You talked about drugs and people, who drug addiction, what have you. Isn't that sort of like this is, in a way, points up the whole problem. Do you treat somebody who is maybe in a state because they have, they've OD'd or whatever it is, does that become a mental health thing, or is that a drug thing, as it were, to the layman?
Sometimes those mental health issues are exacerbated by other things. That could be drink, it could be drugs, it could be debt, it could be a whole range of different issues. And so people can arrive with us with a multiplicity of things that we've got to look at. Some of those are physical matters as well, hence they've got to go to A&E for treatment as well. And sometimes those people are in immediate crisis. And it takes a while for the professionals, and I say this as a non-clinician, but for the professionals to assess that patient and see what help they need. And sometimes a period of time and stability and safety can assist those people being recovering and getting back into their lives. But we are seeing, I'm always interested in trends, and I always ask, what are you seeing that's different at the moment? And we are seeing a whole range of different things happening now, which are leading to more and more young people coming into our establishments, rise obviously in dementia as we have an ageing population, and the comorbidities that people can have as they get older. So we're seeing pressure across the board on the system at the moment.
I'd also say that the complexity of people that are presenting in crisis, that the complexity has increased, and partly that's because they've not been able to seek support, they've not been able to get support at earlier stages. So, you have that snowball effect where lots of different things then start to impact on a person's mental health.
Like a homeless person's picked up for vagrancy or something like that, but it's also maybe a mental health thing.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of people that are rough sleeping will have serious mental health problems, as well as kind of, substance misuse problems. And for people that aren't in those dire straits, that are struggling but might have a roof over their heads, however poor quality that roof is, what you often hear is that they're presenting to services asking for help. They're told by the mental health service, we can't treat you, you can't have access to talking therapies or to a psychiatrist until you've fixed your drug addiction, but they can't get access to help for drug addiction. So they're kind of stuck in this kind of perpetual lack of support for any of their support needs, which understandably then things just snowball and they end up in crisis and often will be picked up by the police.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, we're now moving to the actual frontline response. We've touched upon training, the challenges faced actually on the front line, and colleagues will have some response to that. Caroline, you're leading this discussion.
Thank you. You've talked about the training has been rolled out to frontline officers, but obviously your report really talked about issues with Met culture, discriminatory attitudes and behaviour, and the disconnect between what might be the policy, the leadership policy, but actually the practice on the ground. So training may have been rolled out, there's a tick there, but are you actually seeing real improvements in mental health awareness on the ground among frontline officers?
Is that to me?
Yeah, maybe start with you, Victor. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I'd have to admit I've not been out with the police prior to this meeting, so I actually don't know. I was concerned when I did do the report. I went out several times, and I was concerned. I had actually lots of sympathy with the police because they were faced with extremely stressful situations, but weren't being debriefed or getting the support that they needed. And we did come across a number of cases, really quite sad cases, where police. There was one case in particular where a suicide had taken place of a police officer, which I thought was directly related to the culture within the Met. I have no measure, and I don't have evidence from what's been presented to me that as to whether that culture shifted or not, other than the fact that the Met Police state that they are training police officers and engaging with the police officers in how they look after their own mental health. So there's a specific response in specific recommendation in the work I did about the police actually taking responsibility or taking their duty of care for their own officers seriously, and the response has been that the specialist senior officers now provide police officers with advice and training as to how they should look after their own mental health. What I don't know is what impacts that has had culturally.
And do you have any feel, both in terms of officers and their own mental health and the support they get, but also in terms of how officers routinely are able to deal with the public on the ground who may have mental health issues?
Well, let me speak from my own perspective as somebody who's is at the end of their service, having been based in victim-based roles throughout my service. I think the one phrase that I don't see mentioned when it comes to the mental health of police officers is burnout. burnout occurs more than people realise. I think culturally we have moved on. I think a lot of our younger officers have a better understanding of mental health issues. They're much more conversant with what's going on in the mental health world than my generation would have been. Attitudes have shifted massively, which are a good thing, I can tell you for a fact. But from my perspective, I think officers very often make mistakes or things go wrong because they get to a point where they are overwhelmed with the volume of work that is coming in, the fact that they just seem to rush from call to call to call to call, and they're expected to give this gold star service every single time. And that's fine for a while. But as somebody, when I first came into the job, I was made what was called a SOIT very quickly. Sexual Offences Investigative Techniques, rolls off the tongue really easily. Trained officer. And I managed to do that for a period of about 3 years, continuously working my day job and response, and every single time a sexual offence came in, a rape, whatever, it was mine. Now, I got to a point where that was fine, and then I started burning out. And my ability to actually empathise and sympathise naturally as a human being started petering out. And that's where, I hate to say it, that sort of feeling of, not that I don't care came into it, but I could no longer cope with listening with people with issues, to people's issues all the time, and them offloading and me absorbing it. Now, what the Met used to do back in the day, people like me, was they used to actually rest us and rotate us. So you would have a period of time where you would deal with these jobs, and then you would be stood down and given something else to do. So you refreshed yourself, you didn't burn out. But now, because of the position we're in terms of resources, officer numbers, and the volume of calls we've got, and the complexity of what we deal with now, and goodness me, I would not sit here and knock any one of our partners, other emergency services, anybody in social work, anybody at all, because we are all struggling. We're all doing the same job and all trying to achieve the same thing here. So we do get it, but we do not very often take into account that we're burning officers out. And now with the BCU model, which I hate to say it has caused problems, which I'm not in a position or at liberty to discuss, because you can ask my senior managers at the next meeting in January if you wish to about that. That's put more pressure on people because they're being expected to move and to take on more work and to take on greater responsibility. And I am very concerned that we are, I hate to say this, in some respects almost paying lip service to looking after our officers. Another example I will give you is about the counselling services. Since we've outsourced a lot of our resources, I'm afraid I've got concerns because, yes, we do try to look after our officers' mental health, but there is still, for some of us, a stigma that if you actually show out, you're seen as weak. Culturally, it's always going to be under the surface with a lot of officers, because it's the sort of job where you work with a team of people and you don't want to let your colleagues down. And if you show out and say, I can't do this anymore, you feel you're letting your peers down all the time. So you just keep going and keep going and keep going. And then somebody realises one day you're not very well and that you need to have counselling or whatever. And you phone up counselling services and you find it doesn't work like it used to. It doesn't work in respect that it's flexible. It doesn't work in respect that it understands that we are a 24/7 service. It tells us when we're going to go to it and how it's going to be run from its perspective. And if we miss any of the appointments, we don't get them back. So where an officer might need 10 counselling sessions, they're not likely to get them because shift work will prevent that. So I'm concerned about burnout. I'm concerned about how we rest officers, how we rotate them, and how we actually do really look after them. Because a lot of these recommendations, and bear with me, I've only skim read some of this, I can only speak from experience, and these are the experiences I'm finding. And unfortunately, having been a working rep, it always ends up being too late by the time the officer would come to me.
Okay,
Thank you for
I
that.
hope that answers some of your question.
Yeah, it doesn't pick up the training point, and maybe you're not...
Training.
What training they're getting in dealing with people with mental health issues?
From what I've been told, and my senior managers will obviously have greater detail about this, I know that we have a mental health toolkit, we have a BCU toolkit rolled out, which hopefully by the time we all are BCU live in February next year, will be in place. Mental health teams are going to be much more sophisticated than they used to be. There's a lot of work going on there. I can see real improvements in that. Our probationary student constables are getting mental health input. Our officer safety training sessions also include mental health input as well, particularly when it comes to restraint. And talking from a federation perspective, but not from a Met perspective, my actual role overlaps very much with the Health and Safety Secretaries and our TP, our Territorial Policing Lead as well. And from a personal perspective, I've started to identify that we don't deal with autism very well as one particular subject on its own. And that is everywhere. That's part of what we're dealing with. So, personal level, I'm looking at that from a federation viewpoint. But I think the Met is putting everything it can into training wherever it can. Mind also coming in on the back of this wherever possible. But that is what I've gleaned from where we are at the moment.
Okay, can I go on to Vicki and Andy? Are you seeing, from your work and experience, improvements to the awareness of mental health issues in the frontline staff of the Met Police? And what does, if you like, a baseline level of competency of mental health awareness actually look like for police officers? Maybe start with you, Vicki.
Yes, I think the training and awareness is always a really interesting topic to talk about, because it can so easily be ticked as everyone's watched a 30-minute online video and then it's all done and dusted, you know all about it, whereas obviously the reality of something as complex as mental health it requires much more understanding. So I think there's always going to be a question about when someone has when an organisation has said, yes, we're improving our training, what the training actually looks like. And interestingly, I had an email from someone in the Met last week, which was about a new training package that they've got, and they wanted us to look at it. So we will take it. So they're asking the people that know about it. So I think that's a good sign. I'd also, I think a litmus test for how good training really is whether people with lived experience of mental health are involved in the development and the design of that training, and also in the delivery. That can still be done if it's an e-learning as well as kind of any face-to-face training. So that would be a question that I'd suggest you ask them in terms of what the training really looks like. Has it got people that have had really terrible experiences and also really great experiences with the police? To be able to bring that forward, and also input from mental health practitioners, so people that know what they're talking about. So I can't answer that question as to how good the training is, but I would say that they're indicators of quality training. And the fact that they've been in contact with us to look at it is a positive sign, but I've not seen the actual content. In terms of the issue around the impact that has then in terms of levels of awareness, what we do know is that there have been an increase of the number of interactions with people with a mental health problem or components of a call out that would have a mental health element to it. That's increased. It varies across police forces across the country. It's as low as 2% in some areas and there's up to 40% in other areas. But by and large, more police are reporting that they're coming into contact with people with mental health problems. That could be seen as a proxy indicator that actually they're clocking it earlier and they're identifying it, which again is an indication that maybe the training is coming through and they're just a bit more aware and they're spotting it, and then that's being felt through the reporting. On the other hand, we know that there's increased demand, so it might just be a combination of probably a combination of the two things, really. So so I think that in terms of kind of what the awareness is, actually kind of hitting the front line, that's an area to kind of further explore, I think. Just to finish, really, to kind of put it into context, because we do hear from people that talk about how fantastic the support has been from the police when they've been in a mental health crisis, which is, if anyone who hasn't been in that situation is incredibly scary, and you're very frightened, and to be dealt with compassionately, with empathy and with care by the police, who traditionally haven't been seen in that way, is so important for a person's recovery. So that can be done very effectively, but we know that not everyone has that experience. And the final point on that is to think about it within the context of kind of other personnel that people might come into. So in 2015, when the CQC released a report, that found that the police were perceived as being more successful in providing care and empathetic responses to people in crisis than staff working in A&E or specialist mental health services. So again, it's important to put it within a context. There's obviously still lots of improvements that can be made, but they seem to be getting it right better than the health service, which I think is actually more worrying.
Andy, do you have experience through your trust of dealing with real frontline officers, and what changes have been, and is the training enough? Because, you know, we're told, I don't know, training to do specialist driving is 3 weeks, and I think, you know, the mental health training is probably a couple of hours. You know, is it enough?
There's obviously huge demand on training. Everything that happens, someone usually puts a training recommendation in every report on every aspect of policing. But so in my interactions, I would say at 3 levels. Certainly at the strategic level, I think you've got clearly people who are very, very aware of these issues and very committed to them. The local sort of inspector, chief inspector level, when we have our operational meetings, I found again some really committed officers. And we've had tabletop exercises to talk through various incidents, which have been very, very helpful indeed to iron out some of those problems and rubbing points. Obviously, I only see a snapshot of the frontline officers, but I do visit what we call our Section 136 suites, where people are taken by the police when they've been detained under the Mental Health Act. And I do talk to the officers when I have a chance to, not only the Metropolitan Police, but British Transport Police officers and Kent Police officers as well. And I have almost invariably been very impressed with their sensitivity, the use of appropriate language, their kindness and care, you know, dealing with some very, very challenged people. And so that's my take on it. Clearly, we do have issues, and from time to time, we have things, as I said earlier, that don't go well on both sides. And we do look at those, we do debrief those. And occasionally there are things that cause us some concern, but we raise it with the appropriate people within the Met to talk those things through. But in the main, from my experience, whatever they're doing, I'm seeing the evidence of a much improved performance by them.
And can I just ask a different issue in terms of contacting the police? So people ring 999, they ring 101, they're being encouraged more and more to report things online. Are issues around mental health being lost in that? Is there a risk there that you're concerned about or that you've picked up, and that something needs to be done to adjust that to make sure it's not lost?
I can't talk for the ambulance service, but they are very involved, obviously, in all of these matters as well, and very much involved in the 111 service, you know, from the health service side of that. And I think there's a greater awareness from the operators about what they're dealing with. Quite clearly, you know, we don't know on that first call whether you're dealing with a terrorism incident or a mental health incident or a crime matter. Hence, the police must attend. But I think they're generally speaking pretty quick to investigate and find out what those issues might be. I think one of the real issues from the police side is the sheer overwhelming number of calls. We know that 39s has gone up year on year. We know that 101 that was brought in to alleviate that pressure has gone up year on year. I think it's one of the reasons we see Crime Stoppers getting more and more calls, because literally people can't get through.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of those anxieties when you need help and you just can't get through to get that help. But I can only reiterate, as I say, local relationships and strategic relationships I find are very strong.
So Vicki, you nodded on that. Is there a risk around mental health issues not being identified?
Yeah, I think I was thinking when you were talking, Andy, about some of the work that's actually done outside of London in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. One of the innovations that they've developed is on the health side. Is looking at the kind of the 111, which I suppose is the equivalent of the 101 for health. But you're talking about people that end up being picked up by other part of the system. But they've brought in a kind of 111 press 2 which is essentially for mental health help. Emergency help, which has seen a dramatic reduction in the use of police being called out and in A&E attendance. So they're being able to kind of provide them with support, alternative places to go. And it will be interesting to see whether innovations like that get picked up in the the long-term plan that's I think due out next week.
So that's a pilot in.
I think it's pretty well established now, and it's been rolled out. But we can send you more information and put you in contact with the people that work on that.
Sounds very
Where
again,
is-
that's
where-
not.
So where has that been rolled out? I didn't quite catch.
Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and there will be other pockets of, and this is the classic example within the health service. There's pockets of really interesting stuff that's happening, but whether people hear about it is another matter.
It might be useful to pick up,
Yeah,
because I think
absolutely.
mental health issues with a really pressured system could get lost.
Can I just make a point about training? What I found, the worst thing that can happen to someone is that they are killed as a direct result of a police interaction. What I found that those interactions were largely around the issue of restraint. And one of the recommendations that we made was that the police were trained in alternative forms of restraint other than pain restraint. And a couple of things have happened. One, there's been a national memorandum of understanding signed between the College of Policing and the Met and other police forces about retraining. And that Lord Carlisle did quite a good piece of work on the College of Policing, and I would hope, and then there's the Olasana Lewis law and the work with South Maudsley. I would hope that the police response to mental health is informed by proper training as to what to do in those restraint situations, which are extreme and rare, but they have resulted in the deaths. I would also argue that training at the end of the day is about impact, and so you can only measure impact by talking to the people who've been at the receiving end of police activity. And in order to do that, you have to measure two things. One, how did they feel post the event, which is effectively what I did with 55 people, right? And the other, you have to look at disproportionality. So I'm afraid black people were treated generally worse than white people, right? So it is possible to evaluate training, but you have to evaluate it in relation to actually has the experience of the service changed as a direct result, and has the experience of those more likely to be damaged by that service changed as a direct result.
And just to pick up on that, the Independent Mental Health Act Review, which came out last week, did make a recommendation around equality issues, but particularly looking at police interactions with people from ethnic minority communities under the Mental Health Act needs to be effectively monitored and addressed. So I think that's a very clear indication that we've still got an awful lot to do in that space, for sure.
Lovely, thank you.
Flo.
You just wanted to come back on that last point quickly. So obviously, you may be aware that there's an update on the review of the government's deaths in police custody. There's a parliamentary statement later on today, and I think one of the points, there is. One of the things that they're focusing on is support for families, which will address some of the stuff around accountability. Because again, we do see that the majority of the people who unfortunately die in police custody are from a BME background, and they feel that the system doesn't support them. So just wanted to know, was there anything you wanted to add on that bit? Because I think that's the other bit in terms of the failure of the system.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the statement, but I am aware
really
of the issue in that we worked with one organisation in particular. What we found was exactly that the families of victims and indeed survivors of cases where things had gone badly wrong were often under-resourced compared to the police, and the police took a defensive position. And one of the recommendations that we made was that actually resources were made available, and not much, but resources that the police worked in partnership with some of these organisations, so that actually when things did go wrong, the families got proper support and were able to seek advice in response to the police. I don't know whether that's happened. I know that an advisory group is being established. I don't know who's in it. I don't know which organisations represented.
You got the accept questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, Susan, go on.
Can I just ask a very quick one? Are officers encouraged to use the body cams when they're particularly making arrests? Because obviously restraint, sometimes more restraint is needed if somebody's not well, and it's just so that the officers are covered as well. I mean, these body cams are important for both sides of the situation. So, are they particularly encouraged to? No,
they are. Yes, yes. They've been, as far as we're concerned, they've been a great success.
I know in general,
they've
but
reduced complaints massively.
Yeah.
And I get the impression that officers are using them more continuously now than they ever did. And for anything that involves somebody with mental health issues, I would say they are going on straight away. They are being used as a tool, evidentially.
Okay, thank you.
For protection, not just for the officer, but obviously for
both
person,
sides. That's
for both
what I'm
sides.
saying. Absolutely.
I think it was talked about quite a lot through the passage of Shenny's Law when it was going through Parliament, and also in the Policing and Crime Act. So and you are seeing absolutely more of it. I don't know whether it's now. I can't remember what actually made it into the legislation because there's quite a lot of to and fro in. But absolutely, you're seeing it on a more day by day, case by case basis. It's being used. So.
I mean, body worn cameras are not a substitute for well trained and well resourced officers.
Not what I'm saying at all.
But,
what I'm saying is sometimes what actually happened at a scene needs to be seen by everybody on both sides of the situation, and that's what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yes.
Coming back to the frontline response, so obviously we know that a few years ago they trialled the street triage process where officers could, in a sense, have access to a range of activity to help frontline and community policing to identify people with needs. Do you feel that the Met triage model has helped to identify and address mental health needs of supports suspects and victims?
when we looked at it, the triage model that I think was piloted in Newham, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah,
We thought it was a highly effective model, and we recommended that it should be rolled out. Since then, they're trialling the mental health investigation teams to work with partners. I'm not quite sure whether that's the same thing, but the model that I observed was an excellent model and helped both the police and people with mental health challenges and de-escalated situations so that it was less likely that there were Section 136 or any other kind of restraint was necessary. So what I don't know is whether they've been rolled out universally. It's again this point where there's good practice, but we don't know whether it's been rolled out in exactly the same way as the practice recommends or whether it's been adapted. And if it has been adapted, then the question of how you evaluate its effectiveness needs to be raised.
That's really important because I think there's lots of people talk about street triage, but it actually looks quite different in different places now. In some places you've got kind of a mental health nurse in a police car, others you've got someone in the control room, which seems to be a very effective method. But it's kind of been all labelled under street triage, but it looks quite different in different areas. And so what we do need to see is a much better whole-scale evaluation of what works, because we could be wasting money on things that aren't as effective as in other areas. I'm not saying that they're taking place in London, but the absence of a proper evaluation of that means that you just start to see things that are they're adapted, but they don't really fit fidelity to the model in terms of effectiveness.
And my argument would be that in areas of high demand, the street triage model that we saw in Newham is effective and should be working in those areas.
Because from the report, it states that in 2017, the street triage is available in only 9 of the 32 London boroughs. I'm sure some of that's probably down to funding, and you know, again, we don't need to go into detail about pressures, but equally, if this is something that works, should we essentially be taking that message back to say, actually, could this be rolled out across all the boroughs across London in a form that works?
London's a high demand area. I mean, it requires a partnership between the police and the NHS for it to work, but what I observed is that both services benefit.
And actually quite a lot of planning of, at least of mental health crisis care takes place at a pan-London level. I sit on one of the boards that looks at that area. So there's no reason why street triage can't be factored into into that. They've been looking at how you redesign Section 136 pathways. If you take the whole package, what does street triage look like? And it may well vary locally, because of local need and local geography and boundaries, but you should be, as a Londoner myself, I'd like to know that if I was in a crisis, it shouldn't really matter where in London where I live, I should be able to get a good quality service that gets me to a place that's safe and helps me recover.
Which on that point means a properly available and well-resourced Section 136 suites. At the time that I did the report, I was very concerned about the state of Section 136 suites. I know that that's been improved, certainly in the case of the Maudsley. What I don't know is whether we have sufficient numbers and sufficient support for those suites to ensure that what's just been said by Vicki is true.
The other bit of accountability and frontline responses, services being offered to young people. So again, we look at, a number of London boroughs, mine, the two boroughs I represent, Lambeth and Southwark being boroughs where you have a number of high young people presenting with mental health needs and not getting the treatment that they require. Do you feel that in the policing crime plan that we have here at City Hall, do you feel that there should be something different in terms of how we deal with young people presenting with mental health needs?
I mean, the report that I've read, I don't know whether it's still to date, but the Police and Crime Plan, page 101, refers to young people, and actually we had an all-parliamentary group on this very issue only last week, and there is a huge increase in demand and an inconsistent rollout of things like trauma-informed services to support young people.
Yeah.
And that should be of concern to us, because what we do know is that young people with mental health challenges aged between 16 and 35 are 5 times more likely to have physical challenges as well. So that we have a real, this is a real issue, not for the NHS and for the police. And I'm not quite sure that we've got a consistent way of tackling it in London.
I think by and large the conversations that have been happening around the redesign of Section 136 across London and the crisis care concordats when they were working up and running and working effectively, children and young people's needs weren't effectively met by either of those, and that was widely acknowledged. So then they're definitely not being met on the health side. The police will struggle inevitably to meet those needs because of the unmet need in health. It's a fairly horrifying situation, I think, if you're a child or a young person needing help for a mental health problem at the moment. You're really lucky if you get anything.
And is there anything you wanted to add in terms of...
Yes, on the children and young people, our partnership across South London with Oxleas, with South London and Maudsley and South West London St George's, we're looking at the whole of the Canvas pathway. Because we're very conscious of the fact that the service has not been as good as it should be. When people are detained, they're sometimes placed in premises, in hospitals many, many miles away. And already we're bringing people back. The journey time now is much, much reduced as we're bringing people back into South London. And we're also working together to provide urgent care for young people in a way that we couldn't before. So I think those three trusts working together are beginning to make a real difference. We've got very strong partnerships on forensic as well, again, bringing people back into our area. Not only is it better for the patients and family, it actually saves money as well. And so the third limb of that is the adult mental health crisis pathway, which we're looking at, which is a much bigger challenge. We're looking at 700 beds across the whole of South London. This is a real big issue. But we're particularly looking at 136 suites. There's been a lot of work done pan-London, looking at the ideal locations and size. It's an excellent report, so that unfortunately there's no money attached to those reports. And as already been said, South London and Maudsley have got an excellent 136 suites for themselves there, but it just copes with the boroughs that they cope with. We are amalgamating 2 of ours together so we can provide more 24-hour staffing for that. But the key to it is not just getting people in, it's how do we prevent people coming in? How do we work more with, does triage actually work? Looking at the evidence, what do we mean by triage? Looking at crisis cafes and the evidence around those. And again, we've got to look at the evidence. They all cost a fair bit to run. 24-hour home treatment teams, I think, are real key to this. Because if someone presents to you at 3 a.m. and you're a psychiatrist making an assessment, you know, you've got to be, if you're not going to bring them in, if you're not going to section them, you want to be confident that there's a service that we can refer them to straight away to look after them. There's a massive risk associated with this for everybody. And if we can bring those things in more consistently, I think we can provide a package of care, better for the patient, reassures the clinicians as well that they're doing the right thing. Because, you know, adult mental health wards aren't the best places for some people. No. If we can do our very best to prevent people going in, but it's one of those things, where do you put that investment in? What's the evidence base to show that works so that we can reduce those costs at the other end when we're faced with increasing pressure and demand across the board on these issues? And let's not forget, for a good 50% of the people that present, we've never seen them before. So it's not just about dealing with the ones we know, it's about the ones we don't know. We've got to have facilities to deal with them. I think we know roughly what we've got to do. I think that the big challenge, and there are some positive noises coming out from government at the moment about the priority being given to mental health. And I think we're awaiting some announcements on that to see what that translates into.
Yeah.
Okay, we're moving to the next set of questions. First of all, I'd like to welcome students from the Warren School, Barking and Dagenham. Good morning to you. Welcome to City Hall. This morning, this is the Police and Crime Committee, and we're talking about policing and dealing with Londoners with mental health issues. So hope you find this interesting. Welcome very much. Again, apologies to members. We still haven't got the representation for the National Police Chiefs Council. We are trying to communicate. That's not gone well, and I kind of apologise to you. But there you have it. I am conscious of time as well, so we probably do need to move on slightly. The next set of questions, Sean, I think you're leading on.
Actually, I mean, you've actually touched on some of the issues I wanted to ask about initially already. What I wanted to ask was, what should the ideal response be when a police officer encounters someone with mental health needs? That's a victim or a suspect. I think, Victor, you've said, you know, care, empathy, a sympathetic, compassionate approach is more of what you're already seeing from officers. Andy, you've also said that the use of language you've seen significant improvements in. Is there anything else in terms of risk assessment or professional tools or something that officers should be considering when they encounter somebody that you've not mentioned yet?
We did make recommendations in the report about specific risk assessment tools. I think the Newcastle risk assessment model was one that we recommended, and I think the police have either adapted a similar assessment framework. Again, it comes back to training. The actual College of Policing have recommended that police officers have a 2-day training, so it's not hours. So at that level, there's been a clear recommendation about the amount of time. The Met, as we've said before, do provide training on an ongoing basis around suicide prevention and responses. But, and this is important, certainly in the findings of the Commission, it's not just the police. You know, what we can't have, and what I think is really dangerous, is when the police officer turns up and then rings for, because most of these incidents are not criminal. Yeah. They are health emergencies, and therefore there should be a health emergency response. In an ideal situation, a police officer should be able to call for an ambulance. The ambulance should arrive with an appropriate vehicle, not necessarily but an appropriate vehicle with a trained medical officer who's capable of working with the police to reduce the anxiety of the individual, because it is a frightening situation. Where there is no risk to the public or an individual, that person should be transferred, if necessary, to an appropriate setting for further treatment in an ambulance, not in a police car. That would free up the police to do what they should be doing, and there would have been fewer incidents and fewer deaths. So the ideal situation actually doesn't involve the police for very long and for very much, because the appropriate response is a health one, at the end of the day.
I would just say the area to really concentrate on is the pace and the effectiveness of the handover, the transfer between the different agencies, whether that's police to ambulance or police to health or ambulance to kind of health. That's where we still have the significant problems, and that's both in terms of the personnel that are involved, the vehicles that are used. Conveyancing is a huge issue still. Again, though, important to put it into context. The dramatic improvement that we've seen in the reduction of the use of police cells is something to be really commended. And I know the Met Police work so hard on that to get that number down. It's extraordinary the amount of work that's gone in to make that happen. You're now dealing with the consequence of police officers having to wait for an awful long time before they can find someone a bed or be admitted to A&E. So you've got the knock-on effect in the system. But we've always been very clear at Mind that police cells are absolutely no place for anyone, regardless of their age, to be in if you're in a mental health crisis, because you will often need physical help as well as help for your mental health. And you don't get that you don't get either of those in a police cell very well.
Can I ask Anne, I think you were quite eloquent earlier on about the toll it takes on officers if they are having to effectively act as healthcare practitioners for periods of time. So ideally you'd triage, you'd call in the correct services and hand over quite quickly. But it seems, from the evidence we have, that there are increasingly officers are trying to avoid taking people to police cells as their place of safety, but having to spend time on the phone trying to arrange for other places to go.
Absolutely.
Meanwhile, presumably also caring for the person who's in trouble.
And this takes hours. It can take a whole shift.
A whole shift?
Sometimes it can take a whole shift. It can take 8 hours. Going back in history, when I, first joined, I remember spending 8 hours at Charing Cross Hospital myself with my then governor, desperately trying to get the health service to take somebody in that was very, very unwell, and almost having to abandon them there because there was almost an argument going on. And I think we've improved massively, I hope, since then, but dealing with people with mental health issues is not a 5-minute job, as we all understand. And we're talking about empathy and sympathy and caring for somebody. And I've sat with people before, and I know all my colleagues have, sat there for 3 or 4 hours just talking to people, and I'm quite happy to do that. I have no issue with that. But I've got calls coming out, people screaming in the background, and I haven't got the luxury of spending time. And officers are very frustrated very often because my colleagues, in the main, are really good people. They join the job to be good people and to help people. And they get really frustrated when they've got constant calls. Have you finished? Have you dealt? Have you done this? What are you doing? Well, I'm dealing with this really unhappy, mentally ill, confused young person, and leave me alone. I want to get on with it and give me the resources to do this. And it is a struggle, and it can take that whole shift, and it is very draining and it's frustrating. We want to do our best for people, and quite rightly has been mentioned by everybody here on the panel and people like yourselves. We should not have people who are mentally ill in cells at all. We should be able to say, I'm not great on acts and sections. I never was. I can't quote acts and sections in law, but one thing that sticks in my mind is 4.4 of the 136, which says, we are not employed to diagnose. It is not our role. So at what point does our care stop? How far do you want us to be trained? Do you want us to be the equivalent of psychiatric nurses and doctors? How far do you want our training to go? Because I think there's going to be a limit to it, definitely. And people have got to decide where that limit finishes and whether that's sufficient or not. And if it isn't and it goes wrong, people have got to take responsibility for that. But yeah, it's a timely thing, and it is we want to do our best, and we, you know, as I said earlier, we are struggling with other agencies, National Health Service particularly. And I'm losing the thread of this question.
Don't worry, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Anyway, that's good.
It goes into. It
Can
goes
I
back
ask
into.
Andy to come in maybe, because I think you are doing, you've described already the work you're doing to prevent police having to take responsibility for too long for people.
If I back to your original question, if I was a police officer, I'd be saying I'd want the NHS to take this away from me. You know, and I think the real challenge we have is that's not going to happen for a while. The recommendation in the Professor Wesley's report on Mental Health Act talked about use of ambulances rather than police vehicles. Well, police vehicles take more mental health patients in than ambulances do. We need a very different ambulance service if it's to cope with that. There are pressures on the other end. Quite rightly has been said, we don't want people in police cells. But equally, when we were inspected a couple of years ago, we were criticised for having too many people waiting in our adult mental health wards, waiting on sofas to see if there's a bed available. Our opinion at the time was this was a safe place to be. At least they're with us. In our premises, we can look after them. The result of that is you shunt people back into emergency departments, back into police vehicles. So actually the pressure is from both ends, from the reduction in use of police cells, the pressure on adult mental health beds, and inappropriate not having alternatives, which we are seeking to do. So we've now got more people waiting in emergency departments, waiting in the back of police vans. But we are conscious of this, and as I said earlier, opening up our patient assessment suite that sits between the two, where we can get them in there. And other hospitals, other trusts are doing this as well. I visited one in Southampton just a few weeks ago to look at what they were doing down there. So we all recognise this issue, that we've got to take the pressure away for the benefit of the patient, benefit of A&E staff. They don't want to be dealing with these people either, and for the benefit of the police. But you know, people can wait, as we've said already, for many, many, many hours, and the police officers quite rightly don't see this as part of their role. So there's a number of issues for us to look at here. But I think we're making progress, but I would absolutely understand the frustration of the police about the pace of the progress.
Okay, thank you. There is, Victor, I was going to, can I add another question to what you're about to say? Because the other thing you already touched on earlier on as well was the conclusions about inequality in terms of race, in terms of disabilities and other things that lead to certain groups being treated for being sectioned and being taken into custody and things for mental health issues. And we've also had, again, the independent review, which was mentioned already, of the Mental Health Act, which did have recommendations for monitoring particularly the equality issues. So can I ask, as well as chipping in on this earlier issue, can you outline anything else you want to add on that, and also to Vicki as well?
I was going to say two things really. I don't think anybody's really suggesting that the police have nothing to do with mental health. In fact, they do. In fact, in the report that I did say it was core business. At the time, it was nearly a fifth of police work, so it is core business. The question is, where is that balanced with the duties, the clear duties of other services like the NHS to support them? So the less the NHS and social care do, the more the police have to do, and that's the answer in a way. To, you know, they should be trained sufficiently to carry out their duties in response to public demand, but in public need. But they're not psychiatric nurses. They're not psychiatrists. They're not AMHPs. They're not those things. In relation to your question about discrimination, I mean, I found in the report that there was a disproportionate impact on black and minority ethnic young men in particular in relation to the Met Police response to mental health. I think that the answer to these questions in the following things. One, we need to monitor outcomes and experience of those communities. The Mental Health Act review, which I was involved in, has made recommendations that I think will help by giving more say to people with mental health challenges as to how they wish to be treated before incidents and during incidents, and will ask for review. That will impact on disproportionality. But we need to be ever alert, I think, to the experiences of black and minority ethnic people in relation to the police response to mental health. The only way to do that is to monitor it and ensure that there's reduction in the current disproportionality, which is a reflection of disproportionality across the mental health sector.
Do you feel like there is any monitoring going on? I mean, obviously, is there any ongoing monitoring at the moment, and have they taken on board the recommendations? And
they did take on board the recommendations. What I'm specifically trying to find is whether they're actually monitoring specifically the experiences of black and minority ethnic clients. I don't think that's clear in the information I've got. What they have set up is an advisory group, or they are setting up an advisory group to support the police in this work, and I would suggest that group has sufficient expertise in the experiences of black and minority ethnic communities in relation to mental health and policing, and that they put in place some measures that they're accountable to this august body for reporting against.
Vicki, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on how this interplays with the kind of mental health act review. So by and large, we broadly welcomed the findings and the recommendations in the mental health act review. We were also involved in that. It talks specifically around some of the racial inequalities that we see within the mental health system. And what we need to see are very concrete commitments that attach themselves to the implementation of that review hopefully through the legislation that will come as quickly as it possibly can, given the context that we're currently operating in. I think there were missed opportunities within the Mental Health Act review, so we were looking to get rid of community treatment orders specifically. We think they've been shown not to be very good. They're very disproportionately used for people from black and minority ethnic communities, so for a whole variety of reasons, which all talk to the kind of institutional bias and racism that we've got in our systems. So that would have been one way to really make a greater difference in that area, and obviously the review didn't go that far. It talked about restricting its use, but we would have liked to see them gone completely, because I think that would have it would be symbolic, but it would also have a very practical reality to how people then experience the mental health system if you're from a black and minority ethnic community.
Okay, I just wanted to move on. Is that right? I'm trying to move through questions as quickly as I
I'm
can.
conscious of time, so we do need to move on.
I want to do that. I just want to move on to police calls to mental health facilities. The data we have here is that they receive 13,000 calls from mental health premises a year, and about 4,000 officer attendances happen as a result of those calls. Obviously, that's one of the recommendations from Dame Elish Angiolini's review was there should be a very high threshold for police going into healthcare settings. And Victor, you've already talked about issues with restraint, and so I wanted to ask, how this still seems to be happening a lot, and how can this be reduced, and what could be done to improve how police are trained to deal with call-outs to mental health facilities? Who would like to come?
Yes, we do call the police for a range of reasons. It could be assaults on staff and other incidents like that. It could be to help us with a particularly challenging patient. And generally speaking, the response we get is very positive. From the staff's perspective, and they do suffer many assaults, they clearly want to be supported, and they want matters investigated, because we have a range of patients that we deal with, and occasionally there are tensions about what the police will attend and what they won't attend. And again, we usually have a debrief afterwards if there are some areas of concern. And on occasions they do arrest people. I can see from the police perspective, what are they then going to do with someone who already may be either a voluntary patient with us or someone who's subject to a section. And it's a pity Michael Brown's not here, because he's quite an expert in this issue. But around capacity, and whether or not capacity is relevant or not, to the police investigation in the first instance. But it is an area of concern that our staff have about the protection that they have from assaults. And I do see the dilemma for those who are attending. But there are times when our staff cannot cope with somebody and do need help. And our staff are often no more expert than others when they're dealing with someone who's very, very violent indeed. And we do need assistance to deal with people on occasions. And generally speaking, we get that.
Can I ask, are you aware of which officers attend when there's a call out to a mental health facility? Is it the normal response?
It'd be first would be the response officers, yes.
So nobody with any particular training?
They should all have
No, it
training.
would be your core response teams would go out, as far as I'm aware.
Okay.
I think we hear anecdotally in this space from police who often do turn up, and what they've been asked to turn up to is not what they would see as core police business. So I think that you do hear examples of that, as well as the examples where they absolutely should be called out. And I'd echo the points that Andy said around the assaults on staff, although I'd also add to that to try to understand what's going on in those circumstances that someone becomes incredibly agitated. Sometimes that can't be helped. But other times there's a question as to whether you've got the right support and training of the staff that are on the wards. Have they actually got anything to do with their time? When you're in an inpatient setting, it can be, what people tell us is that's it's incredibly poor experience in many places still, and that all adds to the very uncomfortable atmosphere that you're creating in some wards. And the other aspect to that is about the level of violence and assault that takes place on patients themselves, largely from other patients, but also from staff, including sexual assault, which has been vastly underreported, and police aren't called out for those. And the CQC published a report specifically on sexual safety within a mental health setting that's worth looking at. This is an incredibly complex kind of setup, but there's always many different aspects to any kind of one story that goes on within mental health.
I think we've got that.
Yeah, clearly these people are very unwell. In terms of restraint, is it preferable to have medically trained people doing that than the police being called in?
Well, yeah.
In terms of safety?
Well, the police were trained in pain restraint.
Yeah.
Which is not...
That's the point. I'm going to cut across. That is the whole point, the narrative about the officers that respond, which are clearly response officers, that they have the proper training. I'm going to bring Susan in.
I'll be really quick, Chairman. I've got huge sympathy and understanding for what Anne said earlier, and it's a shame the police officer isn't here. But I wonder if you know the answer to this, Andy. I was with police officers when they took somebody who tried to commit suicide into hospital. And I offered to stay with this person. It was a resident, but the police could not leave them until they'd handed her over. And they weren't required in any way. She was in a bad way because of what she'd done to herself. But they had to wait, and they were there hours and hours. Has this got any better? Because the drain on police resources at the moment in so many different areas is getting more and more wide and worrying because they are spread so much thinner. Has that time been reduced by anyone?
I wouldn't like to say that it has. Obviously, when they go to A&E, there'll be triage there, so they might have some physical problems as well as others. And there will then be, if they decide this is a mental health issue, they'll then call in the mental health appropriate trust, which may not, which then there's a delay into that. It does take time to assess people, and this isn't a broken leg. This is much more complex, and how we assess people. And I know there's a huge frustration from the A&E staff as well as the police about how long that can take. But as I said, this is an area that, certainly from our trust perspective and the South London Partnership, that we're all looking at and are very conscious of, because it's a terrible experience for the patient, let alone the police and the staff.
Yeah.
So how can we improve that, make it safe and make it proper? I think there's a huge challenge. I mean, the analogy I was making with someone the other day, if you had an eye problem in London, you'd probably self-refer to Moorfields. You have one of the world's best hospitals here and open with its own A&E. What about mental health? You know, is A&E the right place to go? Quite rightly, we've said that police cells are not, but I'm not entirely convinced if A&E is the right place either. You know, and it's not going to get any better as we get into the winter pressures. So this is a whole new discussion. It's an NHS issue, it's a huge funding issue, but I think we need to be starting to think ahead about what are we going to do with people in crisis, how are we going to help them, and I'm not convinced that taking them to A&E is the answer. It's, at the moment, it's what we do. I called in at the Queen Elizabeth in Woolwich on a Thursday afternoon to find, and it's not our hospital, it's our neighbour's hospital, to find 7 mental health patients waiting, one of whom had been there 20 hours. This was a Thursday afternoon. This wasn't a crisis time. And if you talk to staff across the country, they'll repeat these stories. This is the issue for me, is how do we deal with this? And I don't think we've got it right.
I'd have to agree with Andy. I mean, this is the very pinnacle of what we call parity of esteem. If you can't have parity of esteem in a crisis, then I would question whether you have parity of esteem at all. So, I mean, I would absolutely agree with Andy's comments.
Yeah, thank you. Right, last set of questions which your message leading on is really looking forward, going forward in the context of limited resources. What longer term improvements can we look at?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, panel. I've got 3 specific questions, and some of your earlier answers have already touched upon issues dealing with longer term improvements, but if I can be very specific. So my first question is to all of you. It's about the crisis care concordat. And so we had Her Majesty's Inspectorate's report, which recently recommended a fundamental review of the concordat. So in your view, what needs to be changed with regards to this concordat? If you could start off with you, Mr. Trotter.
Personally, I think I have no concerns about the concordat at all. I think that and the developments since have been very, very, very positive. And I have no complaint whatsoever about the police response. I think I have a lot of compliments, and not only about the Met, and I know you here don't oversee the British Transport Police, but looking at the work that they do on suicide prevention, I think it's some remarkably good work that's being undertaken there at the moment. I think it's the points I've made already. I think the ball is very much more in the NHS court at the moment about how the NHS responds to these challenges and demands. I think the police have done a great deal. Always a lot more to be done, as there always is. But I think the real issue for me is how do we respond as a system to help people in crisis.
On the concordat and to declare an interest, so Mind to declare an interest around the concordat, because Mind project managed the concordat for the first couple of years of its life, funded by NHS England and government first, and then it's NHS England. I think the concordat, when it was operating at its most effective, was a thing to see in terms of getting those national bodies around the table, working together, tackling some of those wicked problems that we've got within the system. I think since the foot has been taken off the pedal, largely from national government, the infrastructure and the support that's available to local groups has gone away, which has meant that some will carry on and have carried on and still doing good work, but many others will have fallen by the wayside. We know that particularly on the health side, in some areas the NHS aren't coming to the local groups anymore, which I just think is a real shame after so much good progress that had been made. It's coming up to its 5th birthday in February, I think it is, so that it's a very important time to work out what to do with the concordat. And I mean, one of my personal pet peeves is to regularly chase government officials as to when the steering group is going to meet on a regular basis. It's quite painful getting them to do much about that, to be honest. So you could be waiting a long time for the government to do much on that, particularly in the current context. So my suggestion would be for London to take a view on what it wants to do with that body going forward, because it's got all the right people around the table. It's focused specifically on crisis care. And you could do a lot of good work, but you could be waiting a long time to get a steer from national government on that.
Was the concordat after my work?
It came after, yeah, it came after.
So this is the thing. I think I agree with what Vicki said. I think London could lead the way, should lead the way. If you keep looking up, then you're going to miss what's happening when you look out. So focus on London. Firstly, secondly, I think the interest of MOPAC and this committee in this piece of work should not be underestimated. I think the fact that you've been able to focus on this as a requirement of good policing in London, I would urge you to continue, because this isn't all done, and you need evidence that it's actually having an impact, and I think you're in the best position to do that. So that's the first thing. I think secondly, it should be acknowledged that the police are taking this stuff seriously from the top. I think what we need is more evidence that we're changing the experience, forgive me, at the bottom, because I think I agree with you that many police go into the police force to do a good job, and if my recommendation is implemented, then they should be able to do that. I think there are other parts of the Assembly that should pay attention to how they add value to this, in particular what powers the Mayor has to influence what the NHS does. I think needs to be joined up with your concerns, so we do get examples, and we don't get examples where we have things like triage. We get everywhere triage. We get a London that's actually capable of looking after all its citizens all of the time, not just some of its citizens some of the time. And I think the specific pressures need to be resolved outside both the NHS indeed and the police. I mean, some of this is about what's happening with community groups and their engagement with young people, and how young people are supported in such a way that they don't need these responses in the first place, because they're brought up in a community that actually looks after them. So I would say that we've made a strong start. I think you've pushed it a long way, and I think you need to keep pushing it, because the police are under a lot of pressure, and this cannot be allowed to fall off the tree, as it were. But we've made good progress. The future's looking interesting.
I confess to know virtually nothing about the Crisis Care Concordat. So if anyone wants to give me a potted version in 2 minutes, that would be really helpful.
Mile honesty in this committee, so.
Because that's something that I presume Mr House would be better qualified to talk about in January.
Right. We should pose that question perhaps in January.
Yes.
So, Steve.
So because of time constraints, I've got one more question. It's very specifically to you, Mr Trotter and Ms Nash. Lord Adebowale had talked about the Mayor. So what can the Mayor do specifically in terms of improved identification of mental health needs, likely to create more demand for support from health services, at least in the short term? And of course, the police and crime plan commits to influencing health commissioning, priorities for improved continuity of care for offenders between settings. What role does the Mayor have? What can he do?
The Mayor has a really big role in all of this. Doesn't have control of the Department of Health's funding, obviously, or the CCGs, for the commissioning groups. But the symbolism of the Mayor's leadership, London-wide, to coordinate these activities, I think is a very, very central to us making progress. And I think coordinating activity, influencing, pressurising, I think all of those things are absolutely central to making progress in London.
So you see the platform of his office, Ms Nash?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that, and you've seen that in terms of the role that in the past couple of years they've played around kind of Thrive London. You also see that in the conversations that happen at pan-London level around mental health broadly, and I've often been saying to the NHS, you have lots of other tools in your toolbox when it comes to London. Often the conversation can be dominated by the NHS, and actually local authorities in particular play a huge role that are often underrepresented in the conversations that we have, and again the mayoral kind of element of that can just provide additional clout and noise, and we need to translate the noise into action on the ground.
So, I mean, I've just stepped down from 6 years on the board of NHS England, and what I can tell you is that, other than that I'm exhausted, is that I think there is a real opportunity in the notion of population health and place-based health for the Mayor to really influence how health plays its part in London. I note that in the Mayor's policing report, it's 136 pages, the vulnerability and mental health is mentioned on 7 of them in separate areas. So, you know, pages 9, 15, 17, 75, 101, 107 refers to this. What would be really powerful is that if there was an overall strategy that brought it all together and really pulled in the health and the policing and focused on those people at the sharp end of the inverse care law, which states that those people in need of health and social care and indeed protection the most tend to get it the least. So I think the Mayor has a tremendous leadership and convening role to play, and he can hold up a mirror to the NHS using the experience of Londoners as evidence for how it should really work.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Again, guests, thank you very much for your contribution. We have a Q&A with the Met and MOPAC in January, so Stephen Howes will be there, no doubt. We should frame some questions to get the context from Senior Met. So again, can we note the report members and the answers given by our guests? Can we agree to consult and to delegate authority to me to agree on the output from today's meeting? Item 6, can I ask the committee to agree the proposed topics for our thematic meetings in January, being Stop and Search, February, Safe and Able Boards, March, a Violence Reduction Unit, and delegate authority to me to agree the scope for the committee's thematic meetings. The date of next meeting is Thursday the 10th of January. I have no other business other than to wish everyone a happy Christmas.
GLA